Brilliant. Well, good morning and welcome everyone to our Engaging with Evidence series. It's so lovely to have you all join us today. I see lots of familiar faces, but also some people I haven't met before. It's really lovely to meet you. So who am I? The person that's speaking to you over Zoom. My name's Jess Reedy. I am Senior Policy Engagement Officer here at the Government Outcomes Lab. And we have got an hour and a half today for our Engaging with Evidence session on the evolution of the social outcomes partnerships in the UK. Big welcome to familiar people who have come before. We're doing our normal Engaging with Evidence session, but for those of you who haven't been, we'll explain a tiny bit about who GoLab is and how these sessions work before we get going into the content. So about the GoLab, we are a global centre of expertise based at the Blavatnik School of Government here at the University of Oxford. We were established in 2016, basically in partnership with the UK government. Since then, we've diversified further, but at our core, we have been focusing on how we can enable government from across the world, but especially here in the UK, to foster effective partnerships with other sectors. So think about how they partner with the charity, non-profit, private sector, local government, different parts of society, all with the aim of achieving better outcomes. And so that's really at the heart of what we're looking at today. We have all of our resources available on our website. So the session recording will be there, the slides will be there. We've got the reports we're talking about on there. And we really care about making things open and accessible. So if you want to find out anything else about the GoLab, about our work, it's all up on there. And we've got a QR code for you to be able to follow along. So Engaging with Evidence is a peer learning series that we run. And our aim is to basically create this open platform for policymakers, practitioners, researchers to be able to all come together from our different spheres and from all over the world to engage with whatever's the latest research or findings. So we share our own research, but we also share other people's research and have them come and present. And unlike perhaps a lot of meetings, we really care about making this interactive and engaging. And so a massive emphasis for us is the Q&A and stopping to hear from you all, appreciating that we've got things to share, but also there's a lot of expertise in our audience and different perspectives too that we really care about bringing in. So please be prepared for an interactive session. And we will be distilling some of the key research findings today, and that's the general theme of our Engaging with Evidence. As I mentioned, it's a series, so we've already got some more sessions that are planned in the next few months. So if you want to have a look at some of the other topics, they're available on our website. If we could go to the next slide, please. I wanted to take a quick pause to have you all introduce yourselves. So if you're happy to hop onto the chat, come and say hi to us. It'd be great to hear who you are and where you're joining from, what sort of work, like maybe what organization you're joining from or where in the world. I will pause for a moment there. So please do get typing in the Zoom chat. And while you're doing that, I will just mention that I've got my colleague John here who is keeping an eye on all things tech. So if you struggle for any reason, do just ping him a message or he'll pick it up in the chat. And so that should hopefully all go nice and smoothly. Hi, nice to see you, Joe. Aphrodite, you can't hear us. Can everyone else hear us okay? Yep, I'm seeing thumbs up. Brilliant. We will see if we can help you, but it might be a matter of turning on the sound. Hi, great to see you, Judy. Great to see you, Edward. Hi, Emma. Hi, Russ. It's so good to see everyone from a range of different places, from Australia even. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from there, Russ. From Brighton, we've got Tom from Norfolk by the looks of it. Great, keep popping in the chat. And so we're starting off already with using our chat lots. Throughout the session, feel free to put your thoughts, your reflections into the chat. Also put your questions, because I'll be keeping an eye on that. And when we stop for different points of Q&A, I'll come to those questions. And I've also encouraged all of our speakers to engage with the chat there. So please do make the most of that. As I said, this is interactive, and I think one of the true values of doing a session like this is hearing from you. So be thinking and get your questions going. Great, so that's our audience. In today's session, we've got two parts, and I will stop waffling very, very shortly. The first part, as we always do with our Engaging with Evidence, is a presentation. Very excitingly, we've actually technically squished in two today, so it'll be a bit faster paced, but I think it's with really great value. The first thing that we'll be sharing on is I'll have my colleagues, Andrea and Juliana, they'll introduce themselves when they present, sharing on our latest report from GoLab, which is on the evolution of social outcomes partnerships in the UK, hence today's title, distilling 15 years of experience from Peterborough to Kirklees. This is our flagship report. It's only just been launched, and we are really, really excited about it, because it's, I think, one of the first attempts to try and bring together a coherent narrative of what's happened in this field, with the UK being the world leader for social outcomes partnerships, and how has this developed and evolved. So an exciting session. And then we'll also be hearing about some of the evaluation findings from the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund from Neil and James, who will be sharing all about that and who they are when we get around to that. And then the second half of our session, we'll stop for Q&A briefly during that, but the second half is where we really get into the panel discussion, the wider learnings, the interaction with you guys. So please do be prepared to engage. Without any further ado, there's so much I could say, but I'm going to hand over to Juliana and Andrea. Maybe you could introduce yourselves and take the reins.
Great. Thank you, Jess. Can you hear me? Yes. Fantastic. Hi, everyone. My name is Juliana, and I work for the Government Outcomes Lab. And what I would like to do today is to describe or map the landscape of UK social outcomes partnerships in the past 15 years. I would like to divide my time in three, but before discussing the agenda, I would also like to say a few notes about terminology. There is really no single or universally agreed definition of social impact bonds or social outcomes partnerships. They are better understood as cross-sector partnerships that bring together organizations who want to improve social outcomes and want to deliver better public services. Typically, at least if I have in mind the Indigo data standard, what we are looking at is a contractual relationship or a contractual arrangement that have two key characteristics. The first one is that there is payment for outcomes or payments attached to the achievement of predefined social outcomes. And the second one is the upfront repayable finance provided by a third party, the repayment of which is conditional on achieving specified outcomes. That's what we're trying to look at, an outcomes contract and social investment or upfront social capital. I also want to explain a bit how we move from impact bonds to social outcomes partnerships. We all started calling this type of partnerships social impact bonds, but in the desire to distinguish this approach from traditional bonds, we started calling them social outcomes contracts. And in 2023, the UK government, in a nod to the intentional cooperative nature of these approaches, adopted the term social outcomes partnerships. But basically, we're all talking about a social contract or an outcomes contract where there is payment for particular outcomes and upfront repayable finance. If we move to the next slide, I want to, this is a bit of my agenda, my personal agenda for the few minutes that I have with you. I will divide it in three. I would like to describe the landscape of social outcomes partnerships in the UK. Then I will move us on to outcome funds. And then I will say a few words about social outcomes partnerships at the local level. We have identified 100 social outcomes partnerships in the UK, and I am saying a number that is not the number that we publish in the report. In the report, we say that there are 99 social outcomes partnerships. This is because the moment between writing the report and today, we got new data on one more social outcomes partnership that was commissioned in North East Lincolnshire. So the actual number that you will see today in the impact bond data set is 100 social outcomes partnerships. If we look at the distribution of these partnerships across policy sectors, you will see that more than a half of these projects are about employment and training and homelessness. And we have also seen a good number of projects about children's services or family services and health. And then on the left side, you will see a chart about what are the outcome metrics that have been used the most. And this is related to work that my colleague Eve Grennan was leading. She coded every single outcomes metric in the impact bond data set to see which were the outcome metrics that were being used the most. And we discovered that the outcome metrics that were used the most were related with job retention, improvement of learning outcomes, housing retention, increase in employment rates, and volunteering engagement. And then when we get to share the slides, you will see all the other outcome metrics that have been used multiple times. I will move us on to outcome funds. We have identified 10 outcome funds in the UK. If you look at the chart on the left side, you will see 11 names. That's because we are counting social outcomes, the Social Outcomes Fund and Commission and Better Outcomes Fund as one. I know some people consider those as two different outcomes funds. So depending on how you consider those two funds, it could be 10 outcome funds or 11 outcomes fund. But what you can see here on this graph that shows how many projects were supported by outcome funds over time is that the first outcome funds to start operating in the UK were the Innovation Fund and the GLA Rough Sleeping Programme. And if you look at the last years, the three outcome funds that have been supporting the most projects have been the Life Chances Fund, the Refugee Transition Outcomes Fund, and Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund. And then on the right side, there's a tree map where you can see the distribution of central government commitment to outcome funds. And you can see very clearly that the biggest central government commitment has been from DCMS and the Life Chances Fund. However, if we move to the next slide, you will see that for the Life Chances Fund, the projects from Life Chances Fund actually get more funding than the funding coming from DCMS or central government. That is because the central government was working in partnership with the series of local authorities. So for these 29 projects supported by the Life Chances Fund, local commissioners have raised more than the £100 million. So this is really to show the catalytic power of outcome funds. And the final chart that I want to show you is on the left side, on the right side, and you will see the distribution of projects by type of outcome funder. And this data is good as of June 2024, but what I want to show is that more than 70% of the projects have been commissioned by both a local commissioner and a central government. I don't have much more time, so I will move us to the next slide, where I will leave you with a QR code to the impact bond data set. And I invite you all to go and have a look, because you will see the project profiles, and you will have the opportunity to see some results data for the social outcomes partnerships in the UK. And I will leave the floor to Andrea.
Yeah, thanks so much, Juli. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. I think many of you know me. I'm Andrea Anastasio. I'm the Executive Director at the Government Outcomes Lab, and I've spent the past 8 years of my life learning about social outcome partnerships or social impact bonds, both from the academic research and evaluation work that we do here within the Government Outcomes Lab, but also very much by learning from practitioners, learning from government officials who've been working on the development and implementation of these partnerships. Jess has been quite mean with me and Juli, so we only have about, I think, 10 minutes in total. So I hope I'll do justice in just giving you a flavor of some of the key messages that have emerged both from our research work and from our learning from practitioners over the past 8 years or so. And I'll start by noting what I think many of you on the call are aware of. So since 2016, the GoLab has been the learning and evaluation partner for the Life Chances Fund, which is Juli explained is the largest outcome fund to date in the UK, and it supports 29 different projects across England. This is an ongoing evaluation that we're running within the GoLab team, and the final findings of our work, including impact evaluations for 2 of the projects supported through the Life Chances Fund, won't be available until spring next year. So watch this space. We'll come back to you hopefully in spring next year to share those final findings from our evaluation work. But in the meanwhile, I've put here on the slide some of the interim evaluation reports that my colleagues have
published. And I know John or Jess have the links ready to share in the chat, because I do want to encourage you all to read those reports if you want to get a really good sense as to the evaluation and evidence we've built so far. But within the Go Lab, we take a holistic approach to evidence generation, which is why alongside the independent evaluation work that we've been doing, to build open access, comprehensive data assets that can be used by the whole community of practice, that can be used by researchers, and that can be used by policymakers. And all the wonderful graphs that Huli shared just now, we couldn't have put those together if it hadn't been for those data assets, and in particular the global impact bonds data set. And again, I know many of you use it a lot, but we'll share the link in the chat just in case for those of you who are perhaps new to the fields and are not familiar with it. And the third thing that we do to get a sort of like holistic, comprehensive view of the evidence is we work really closely with the community of practice, both in the UK and internationally. And we're really proud that over the years, we've really managed to build this community of practice for learning. And I emphasize these three elements, that the research work, the data work, and the policy engagement and knowledge sharing work, because without these three elements, we couldn't have produced the report that Jess has mentioned in her introduction. So over the summer, we've been working with researchers, not just within the Go Lab, but from other research centers, evaluation organizations, and so on. We've worked with practitioners without directly involved in the implementation of social outcome partnerships, and we've worked with government officials to put together this, I dare say, quite ambitious report that tries to distill 15 years of experience with social outcome partnerships or impact bonds in the UK. And because I have very little time, I only want to emphasize 3 points. And the first thing that I want to actually ask you all to do, or encourage you all to do, is to download the report, read it, and also share it with the relevant colleagues or with your relevant networks. Because if you're completely new to social outcome partnerships and you're just looking to get your head around very quickly around the sort of basics around the state of play, then there are dedicated sections in the report that speak to that. So in particular, part 1 and part 3, I think provides very quick, very handy, I guess, introduction to social outcome partnerships in the UK. If you have some familiarity with social outcome partnerships, and I know many of the people we have on the session with us are, dare I say, experts on social outcome partnership, there's actually a lot in the report for you too. And in particular, section 2 of the report brings together a collection of 18 essays, most of them actually guest authored. So it's not Go Lab's perspective necessarily or Go Lab views. We've given the community of practice the opportunity to distill and share their own experience and learning. So that's point 1, read the report. It's worth it. Well, and the second thing that I want to do is actually use this opportunity to say thank you and acknowledge the contribution of all the guest authors on the report. And in particular, their willingness to be open, honest, and really thoughtful in what they've shared. It's not a report that paints a rosy picture and claims everything is great. I think you'll find across the different contributions that actually they're very thoughtful in recognizing both some of the challenges we've seen in the field, some of the limitations, or perhaps early expectations that haven't quite been met, but also where we've seen great impact and great promise. So this isn't a Go Lab report per se, it's a report by the community and for the community. And then finally, for those of you really, really busy who just want to jump straight to the conclusion, I've put here on the slide our attempt as the editors of the report to synthesize some of the messages that come through very strongly from the report. And I'll go through them very quickly, one by one. So the first is that we've seen that social outcome partnership can enable more adaptive, accountable, and person-centered approaches. But the emphasis is on can, it's not a given, and we're not saying that any social outcome partnership, just by virtue of being a social outcome partnership, will achieve this. What we need is deliberate and careful design. And that takes me to our second point, which is that there isn't a magic formula that will unlock some of the benefits that we see discussed in the report. I think most people who've worked on a social outcome partnership will agree that it is hard work, and that parties involved need to think very carefully both about the technical elements of their programs, so things like outcomes measurement, agreeing meaningful outcomes, making sure we're including the voice of the intended beneficiaries. But you also need to think very carefully about the more relational elements. Think about your governance, think about how you're embedding this very adaptive, flexible approach to delivering social programs. And lastly, our final point in the conclusion of the report relates to the importance of having an enabling environment. We know that social outcome partnerships can be technically complex to develop for a number of reasons that I don't have time to go into right now. Perhaps we'll come to in the discussion. But what we've seen is that it's really important to think from the onset about the enabling factors, about your system level factors that will influence the success of the project. And then finally, because the title of this session is the evolution of social outcome partnerships, I wanted to share a couple of reflections. Many of them, as I've put here on the slide, some are personal, some are grounded on some of the evaluation work we've done so far. So firstly, I think we now have a much more subtle or nuanced understanding of what social outcome partnerships or social impact bonds are for and their mechanisms for impacts. And I think increasingly we're hearing less about social outcome partnerships, about a sort of snazzy, wheezy financing instrument. And more, we're hearing more about social outcome partnerships as a tool for more effective cross-sector collaboration. And I think that's an important distinction, and we can argue whether that's just a superficial distinction or whether there's something deeper there. But I think that's really interesting. The other point of evolution that I've seen is around the quality and availability of data and evidence, which has definitely increased significantly over the past 10, 15 years. We have a number of evaluators with us on the call today, not just on the GoLab side, but from other organizations and from other outcome funds and social outcome partnerships in the UK. However, I do want to emphasize that that's not to say that we've answered all the questions. So I do want to get this point across that there are still many tricky questions and gap in the evidence that remain. And perhaps I'll leave it to Neil, and James, who will speak in a moment, perhaps to sort of give you a flavor of why we still have some gaps. And then finally, a shift that I think is really significant, and I'll remind you all, we're based at a School of Government, so ultimately what we're interested in is how can we improve government, how can we enable government to work more effectively with other organizations for better social outcomes. So I'm encouraged to see a shift from organizations talking about pilots and this understanding of we're going to use pilots as proof of concept as the main pathway to scale, to actually, I guess, more mature conversations and the growing recognition that actually we need to be deliberate, again, from the start about how we use the experience, the evidence that we're generating through the use of social outcome partnerships to strengthen public sector commissioning and local systems of service delivery more widely. To me, I think that's where the really exciting work comes into play if we're thinking about the big ambition around improving public services, reforming public services, and having a long-lasting legacy. And so finally, I want to leave you all with a quote from the report. I think it's quite lengthy. Maybe I know we'll share the slides, so I'll give everyone the chance to read the quote in its totality after the session. But just in a nutshell, and you might agree or disagree with me, but I would argue that if we are interested in system level impacts and long-term legacy, then the goal shouldn't necessarily be more SIBs or maybe bigger SIBs or social outcome partnerships, but rather that the goal, the long-term ambition should be more outcomes-oriented public services. I'll stop there because I know we have lots of other interesting things to discuss, but I hope we'll come back to some of the themes that I've covered in the discussion part of the session. So back to you, Jess.
Thank you so much for that. And I know we've had some more people joining. Welcome, welcome. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat, and thank you to everyone who's already introduced themselves. We have a moment now to pause if anyone has a question for Andrea or Juliana. I see that the chat is currently a little bit quiet, but there's time later if nobody has any immediate questions, and we can circle back around. But if you have a question, feel free to use the raise hand function or pop it in the chat now. I will pause for 1 second. Cool. Great, we've got a few going in the chat. Do keep adding your thoughts. Chris, given that you got there first, are you happy to unmute yourself and share your question? Otherwise, I can read it out, or your reflection.
No, fine. Happy to share. Good morning. It's still morning in the UK, but maybe afternoon elsewhere. Good morning, everybody. It's really my frustration with the NHS and with health services generally. 11% of UK GDP goes on health services, and health services is therefore underrepresented in terms of outcomes partnerships. And there are some issues also about longer term sustainability. There's then an issue in terms of research design isn't the same as operational design. National Institute of Health Research has a budget of 1.3 million in 2022. How do we persuade them to spend some of this on outcomes commissioning rather than and operational design rather than research design?
Hey, thank you so much for that question. And I'm sure that many of our panel will later want to pick this up, but sort of a question about how do you shift where it's not been possible, more of a upstream prevention and also more of an outcomes focus where it's not been adopted so far. Andrea, would you be happy to give us a little reflection before we go on to our next bit?
Lucky me, Chris, you are asking fantastic question, and one that I think in one way or another many of the people on the session and in the film or generally have been asking. And I guess I will shift it a little bit, not to reflect just on kind of why haven't we seen health or the NHS come forward more, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will have views on this as well, but kind of like more generally, why haven't we seen more of like government spending on social programs, health programs done in this way? And I think there's a suite of some quite technical reasons why we haven't seen that, and also I think some sort of, I guess what I would call sort of systemic reasons or barriers to do with how difficult it is to maybe foster more innovation within government or get big bureaucracies to do things differently. And again, I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone here to hear me say that preventative programs are, I guess it's well known that they're difficult to fund, and we've actually seen social outcome partnerships being used effectively in that space. So I'm afraid I don't have a straightforward answer to your question. I know we have people from government on the panel. Just I don't know whether you want to take a stab. I think as far as we're concerned at the Go Lab, in terms of this kind of like wider engagement with government departments, there've been a number of things that we've done. One, try to strengthen the evidence base, or the quality of the evidence available, and also the accessibility to that evidence to help practitioners make the case to government officials as appropriate. And the other thing that we found it's equally important is to help curate peer learning networks within government. So we've been working very closely with our partners in DCMS, for example, to try to have sort of cross-Whitehall conversations around the value and opportunities to use social outcome partnerships as appropriate. But perhaps I'll stop there and give a chance to my fellow panelists to chip in.
Well, I think because of time, I'm going to say we'll pause and pick this back up, because I think it's a wider thread that'd be really nice to get into about prevention, how to move to more of an outcomes focus in our panel discussion. But I've noticed there's one question just in the chat on terminology. So if anyone has any questions about this, we're not going into a lot of depth of explaining how all of the basics work, but we've got a whole bunch of resources on our website. But if you're confused at any point, put a question in the chat and we'll clear it up. Social impact bond and a social outcomes partnership, same thing. There's been a movement in the terminology away from social impact bond, which reflects a change in sort of emphasis of practice, to a social outcomes partnership, because in the past, there was more of an emphasis on the investment side, on this idea that maybe there'd be a whole bond market of these tools that almost could be traded in. That's not how the practice has developed. Instead, there's been this more emphasis on it being a partnership and a really unique way to be able to partner across sectors and also at a very local level, and more of an emphasis on the outcomes angle of it and that outcomes focus. But we'll pick this up further because it really resonates well with this conversation about why has the language evolved? Well, it's because the practice has evolved. So we'll talk about that more in our discussion. But mindful of time, keep putting your questions in the chat. We'll keep going with them. But for now, let me hand over to James and Neil. Could you introduce yourselves and please share your presentation with us?
Thank you very much, Jess, and nice good morning also to everybody in UK and welcome everybody else. So yes, I'm James Ronicle. I'm a director at Ecoris. It's a research and evaluation organisation. I led on the Commissioning Better Outcomes evaluation. Neil, would you like to quickly say hi?
Hi, Neil Stanworth, Director of ATQ Consultants. We have partnered Ecoris, and James and I have worked closely together on this for a decade.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, so as Neil just mentioned, the Commissioning Better Outcomes evaluation, which we'll talk about in this presentation, has been ongoing for 10 years. We're just in the end point of finishing off our final report. It's not published yet, but we thought, given the sort of change in government, possible increased interest in this area, we thought now would be a very pertinent time to present on the findings from the evaluation. So we're going to spend 10-15 minutes, and we've split our presentation into focusing on the kind of design aspect of the outcomes contracts within the CBO fund, their impact, and then reflecting a bit on legacy as well at the end. Juliana did a fantastic introduction, so I can skip some of this or be comfortable with some of the terminology. But the CBO program, which you will have seen in Juliana's slides, was the second outcomes fund to launch in the UK. The first one that had a local government focus. So most outcomes funds in the UK have come from central government, kind of central top-down programs. CBO was what we call a kind of top-up fund. So the National Lottery Community Fund, a non-departmental public body in the UK and the largest funder of the voluntary sector per year, launched an outcomes fund where they provided top-up outcome payments to local commissioners, predominantly local government, but also local health and crime organisations as well. It ran from 2013 to 2024. It provided funding initially for feasibility work and development grants. It provided 62 grants there, and it then provided outcome payments for 27 SOPs, which involved 100 service providers. The evaluation itself, so we were commissioned over this time, so we've been tracking the programme since 2013, and as I said, our final report will be published next year. We were really focusing in on the SOC or SOP element, so how does the design, delivery, impact, legacy of the programme, how is it affected by the fact that it's funded through a social outcomes partnership? It was a mixed methods approach, but predominantly we focused in on tracking 9 of these projects, these in-depth reviews, visiting them at the beginning, middle, and end of the evaluation. And the link at the bottom here, every single one of these in-depth reviews has published reports connected to them. So if you're interested in any specific things that we mentioned today, by all means go and dive into those. And I should also say 15 minutes is not long for a 10-year evaluation. So I'm going to give me and Neil are going to give a very high level overview. There's a huge amount of variation in CBO and a huge amount of nuance. So if you're particularly interested in something we say or a particular project, there's quite a lot of sort of specific reports that you can delve into some of that detail. So I'm going to firstly talk about the design. Neil will talk about the impact, and then I'll finish on legacy. So one of the aspects we were looking at was, were these SOCs well designed, and what lessons can be learned for future people interested in designing SOCs? One thing to, I think, really stress about the CBO program was it was at its time and still is an incredibly innovative program. Many of the SOPs that were launched were done in policy areas for the first time. The first ever health SOP in the world was launched under CBO. There was travel training, there was zero HIV, incredibly innovative. And the program also, because these were some of the first outcomes contracts to ever launch, was also very experimental with trialing different kind of designs and approaches. We used the Go Labs walking the contractual tightrope framework to kind of get a sense of, well, were these well designed based on that definition of kind of what a good design of an outcomes contract is. And we generally concluded in two out of three areas that they were. There was a very good link between the outcomes payments and the focus of the project and the policy objectives. So they aligned with what people were trying to achieve. There was also minimal evidence of perverse incentives as far as we could tell. But the level of rigor in terms of the outcome measurement was quite low. And it's also low when you compare the outcomes contracts in the UK with others launched in Europe and also in the US. So it was a design choice that aspect was quite low. And as we touch upon later, that did have some knock-on consequences for the sort of legacy of some of these. As I said, what I've got in this slide, which I won't spend too much time on, but this is some of the very innovative and new aspects of designs of SOPs that were added to CBO, some of which very successful, some of which less so. And this just, I can pick up on some of these in the Q&A if you're particularly interested. But on the next slide, we highlight some of the key lessons learned that came out of the design of the SOPs within CBO. First crucial aspect is many SOPs that are initiated do not launch. 80% of the areas that received a development grant through CBO did not then launch an outcomes contract. That is not a negative thing. This was incredibly innovative. There was a fantastic stat in the SOC conference that 2/3 of innovation and R&D doesn't progress. So it's kind of within that ballpark. But the consequence of that was that money was then committed to projects that then did not launch. And so there's actually quite a large underspend in CBO. And I think it's quite similar in other outcomes funds as well. So when designing programs like this, it's very much worth bearing that in mind. Be wary of optimism bias. A lot of the outcomes contracts were being modeled on quite areas where the data was quite thin and overestimated the level of referrals they would receive, people they could engage, and outcomes they would likely achieve. And again, that kind of had knock-on consequences as well. It's important to involve all stakeholders early on during conversations, both internal and external to your organization. Launching SOPs requires senior buy-in and support. They're new, they can be seen as quite risky, and they do need that kind of senior sponsorship to progress. It's very important to clearly define risks and responsibilities up front. We saw a lot of the outcomes contracts being renegotiated halfway through, and often the basis of the renegotiation was not clear agreements or not clear alignments on who's responsible for what and where risk sits with who. So trying to define that as clearly upfront as possible would be very helpful. And it's also important, though not easy, to strike the balance between rigor and simplicity. I think we found some of the outcomes contracts were trying to be as perfect as possible, minimize incentives as much as possible, but they ended up, for some of them, being very complex designs that even the organizations delivering them or the intermediaries actually struggled to really understand them. And at times that actually led to quite significant implications. So that's something also worth bearing in mind. I am now going to pass over to Neil, who will give a summary of the impact coming out of CBO.
Okay, thanks, James. Before I start, I would emphasize what James has said, that this is an extremely quick overview of some extremely detailed work. I did a quick count. There are 29 substantive outputs from the CBO evaluation to date. So probably between 15,000 and 2,000, 20,000 words so far generated by this evaluation. So please do go and look at the detail on the National Lottery Community Fund website for a lot of this. I want to talk about three aspects very, very briefly. First, the performance achieved by the projects themselves, their impact in terms of the SOC effect that James talked about earlier, and lastly, the effect of the fund itself, the CBO fund. So first, this shows the impact of the projects themselves. The boxes on the right show the impact of the projects against the 4 key metrics that we have alighted on as the most important: their engagement, the outcomes they actually achieved, the amount that was paid for the outcomes, and the return to investors. The last one is probably the most technical, but the money multiple is essentially the amount that was paid back to investors as a proportion of the amount that was invested in the first place, and was almost exactly break even, but actually slightly ahead of break even. On the left, you'll see how the variation, that sort of variation applies across all the projects. So there's quite a wide variation, but that shows the outcomes achieved against plan. So that's a breakdown of the orange box, effectively the median outcome achievement, which shows there are some significant outliers. So overall, they achieved quite well. The only caveat on that is that we measure performance against the plan agreed with the National Lottery Community Fund when they applied for CBO funding, which is called the median scenario in technical terms. So we're obviously measuring performance against themselves, but as James has already mentioned, we saw quite a lot of optimism bias in the projects. So it's a reasonable measure, but clearly we're not talking about high quality impact evaluation here. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. This table shows what we identified as the main benefits of the projects being constituted as SIBs, SOCs, or SOPs, depending which terminology you want to use, and the key downsides of them being so constituted. The first 3 positives, I think, are all aspects of the same things, which is the fact that the overwhelming finding is that they were better managed. Partly, the better performance management means that there were independent teams who were focused on managing the performance, but underlying that are the 2 others above and below that, which is improved data management. They had better data, they had better data systems. Many of the projects did deep dives into the data to understand what was going on within the projects, and they then used that data to course correct. So they were able to adapt much more easily than conventional projects, in our view, and that was one of the key benefits. The biggest challenge by some distance is stakeholder engagement, and James has already highlighted in the design some of the challenges of stakeholder engagement, and that continued into performance and to the implementation of the projects. And I think it boils down to 2 aspects. One is key stakeholders who were not given as much attention as they needed to be given because projects misunderstood the importance of particular stakeholders. But more fundamentally across the projects, the simple fact of major stakeholder churn. There's one particular project where there were 3 changes of organisation, including the complete abolition of the commissioner partway through the project, and multiple changes of personnel within those 3 organisations while it was going on. And yet, despite that, it was a successful project. But clearly, those running that project had a massive challenge of continually re-engaging with a complex project throughout that. So to move on to the final, to the second aspect of that, achievement of use cases through the last 3 years really of our synthetic review, pulling all the reviews together, we've looked at what the projects said they were trying to achieve and whether they achieved it. And this really looks at that in summary form. The strongest aspect is, again, as you might expect, given what we concluded from the SOC effect, is that they improve delivery performance and accountability. The weakest justification, which is an interesting finding in terms of what initially was part of the promise of these sorts of projects, was that they didn't create the virtuous circle of investor save that some of the projects were hoping for. That isn't to say that they didn't achieve significant payback. In many cases they did, and in some cases they achieved payback when it wasn't a particular use case of the project. But some of the projects did not achieve the payback that they were hoping for, either because the scale wasn't there, so they didn't get the scale that they expected, or because they couldn't comfortably attribute any benefits they got to the intervention and the project. So to move on to the last aspect, the impact of the program. I mean, clearly it had an overriding objective to create more social outcomes partnerships, and it did that. 27 projects were created. The development grants, as James has already highlighted, were a critical element. It differed from its predecessor program, the Social Outcomes Fund, in doing that. And it seems to have been quite critical to getting many of these innovative projects off the ground. And it had a massive learning element that was applied to future projects, both within the program and outside. Stakeholders have told us quite clearly that the LCF learned quite a lot from this program, and individual projects have learned from it. The biggest downside, as James already highlighted, there was quite high project attrition. So a lot of projects didn't get over the line, which meant there was an underspend on the program as a whole. And there are some related challenges around that whole issue of stakeholder engagement. So the fact that there was high turnover of staff, particularly in local government, meant that a lot of that learning just isn't embedded in organizations. It's moved on with individuals and has been lost to the organizations themselves. And that also meant the program had major challenges in gathering data on its own performance and at the end of projects. So it has been a major challenge both for the fund and for us as evaluators to get consistent data. And the last thing I'd highlight is that many stakeholders told us that the rules of the fund were quite prescriptive, both in their own terms, in terms of the rules that you had to comply with to get the funding, and how the rules shifted from fund to fund, which I think is quite an important factor. So the feedback was it would have been nice if there were fewer rules. It's quite a difficult one because we understand that the rules needed to be there for very good reasons. But I think for me, it's more of a criticism of the fact that there wasn't a consistent set of rules that were applied. So projects that were funded by more than one fund found that they were having to adapt and change as they went along to a different set of parameters. That is the quickest overview you'll probably ever get about 10 years impact evaluation. So I'll hand back to James. If anyone has any questions, obviously I'm happy to answer them later in the panel.
Thank you very much, Neil. I'm going to talk about stakeholder experiences and legacy in just a few minutes, and then happy to take any questions and then onto the panel. Generally, stakeholders had positive experiences of being involved in outcomes contracts. As I said, there's a huge amount of nuance within that, and unsurprisingly, people had more experience in the outcomes contracts that generally were more successful. But we found commissioners particularly liked them because of the increased focus on outcomes, the level of data and understanding of achievement that they were receiving from it. But they also found them difficult to design, difficult to launch, and difficult to oversee as well. And of all the different stakeholders, the pros and cons was probably most marginal for commissioners. And often what tipped it more into the positive rather than negative experience was the ability to access the top-up funds from the National Lottery Community Fund, which is a very critical point that we'll move on to when we reach the conclusion. Service providers felt very often the outcomes focus raised their game. They particularly liked those with experience of working with local government contracts, particularly liked the outcomes focus, which often freed them up from quite bureaucratic delivery, and they could be much more flexible with their delivery. And investors also very much like them because there's a very clear alignment between their financial returns and their social returns, and particularly compared to other forms of ESG, where it's very difficult to really show the social impact of your investments. It's very, very clear within outcomes contracts. And this slide here very briefly shows we did a range of surveys with different stakeholders. And this question here was the likelihood of being involved in another outcomes contract based on current experience. And you can see for every stakeholder, around 80% were saying they would be very likely to get involved again. However, the reality is slightly different to that. When we talk about legacy and sustainment, we need to think about both the intervention and then the outcomes contract. The interventions, the legacy from CBO is very strong. About 2/3 of the interventions that were funded from CBO have continued to be funded after the program. I evaluate a lot of national funding programs from government and others, and the sustainment of experimental innovative programs is usually pretty low. So I think 2/3, I was very surprised by that. I think it's very impressive. My interpretation as to why it's so strong is very much linked to the SOC. It's because I think what CBO did is you had local areas that were quite interested in doing an intervention, weren't quite convinced enough to fund it separately. So maybe the evidence base wasn't strong enough. Maybe they thought it was a bit risky. Maybe they didn't have enough funding. And the SOC and the lottery funding tipped them over to the edge into doing it. And then once they saw the impact as a result of the program, they continued to fund it. However, the legacy of the outcomes contract itself is much lower. Of the 9 in-depth reviews that we looked at, 5 were refunded, but only 2 of those refunded through an outcomes contract. And only 2 of those 9 organizations went on to be involved in future outcomes contracts. And this chart here kind of shows, I mean, Juliana had a different version to this earlier, the number of outcomes contracts launched. And you can kind of see they peak in 2017. There's quite a flurry of activity from 2017 to 2020. That is almost all CBO and Life Chances Fund. And when those central funding pots end, you can see the number of outcomes contracts peter out quite substantially. And we would say we're in a kind of period of stasis here, and that the appetite from local government without additional funding is quite low. And it's because the point I made earlier, where for a local government, the benefits are there, but also there's quite significant barriers and challenges to launching outcomes contracts. And usually that additional funding is the thing that tips it over the edge. And so I don't think it's a surprise that without that additional funding, we're not really seeing the funding of outcomes contracts. If we can move on to the last slide, I apologize. I don't know why that text at the bottom is so massive, but what can we conclude from all of this? I think the CBO program played a critical part in growing outcomes contracts in the UK. It supported innovative new designs. It broadly met its objectives, achieved good levels of outcomes, and made a moderate return to investors. It's helped us understand when SOCs are more suitable, also when they're less suitable. And this box here in the top right kind of summarizes that. We think they're most suitable when what you're trying to do is achieve both a mixture of flexibility and accountability. So you want to free people up to experiment and innovate, but you also want to ensure that there's a key focus on outcomes as well. It's also critical that outcomes are measurable and that people have the capacity and ability to engage in quite a complex contract. Based on what we've looked at in the CBO, we think that SOCs still have a valuable role to play in local commissioning. But at the moment, with very tight funding, little room for innovation, local capacity in local government being restricted, and a default to current contract management practices, the likelihood, in our view, of SOCs being sustained without any future central outcomes fund is probably pretty low. Based on the value of CBO and the impact of it, we would therefore recommend that running a similar outcomes fund to CBO would be worthwhile. The key recommendation we would make in designing a future one is to make it place-based. The underlying assumption we think of CBO is if you fund many areas to do one outcomes contract, they'll then learn, it'll be embedded, and more will be done. We have found that not to be the case, and we think it's because there wasn't really a critical mass. So it often laid with 1 or 2 key champions. When they moved on, the knowledge, the interest of outcomes contracts tended to wane. So our recommendation was, if you were to do a future outcomes contract, do it place-based, focus in an area that is very interested in doing them, build a critical mass. Don't just fund the outcomes, but also invest in the capacity of that area to do them. And our final point, though, would be that SOCs are not a sticking plaster to challenges in local government commissioning. And the assumption or perhaps hope that if you provide a small amount of funding, more will launch is probably unrealistic in the sort of current constraints that they face. And so investment in local government capacity would have to go alongside any of the outcomes funds. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, James and Neil. It was brilliant to actually get to hear a little bit more about a really tangible example with CBO. The other one, just for anyone wondering, the acronym mentioned a few times, LCF, is the Life Chances Fund, and particularly James McGowan, who will be on our panel, is a great person to speak to a little bit of that. I'm mindful of time, and I'm mindful we've got a lot of exciting questions in the chat that have been posed to James and Neil, but I think also a number of our other panelists would probably be keen to jump in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move us on to the panel discussion now, but very shortly aim a lot of these at James and Neil so they get the opportunity to respond off the back of their presentation. So I'm going to begin by inviting my panelists to introduce themselves. So you've already met Andrea and Juliana, and you've met James and Neil. James McGowan, could I come to you next to introduce who you are, what you do, and maybe also a sentence about the Life Chances Fund, if that's not too difficult?
I can do that. Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name's James McGowan. I head up a team called Public Service Partnerships in the Civil Society and Youth Directorate, which sits in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport in the UK government. We've been leading the Life Chances Fund for the length of time that it's been running for. It's a £70 million programme committed by the UK government's support. What has been 29 different projects across England to deliver social outcomes partnerships.
Great, thank you so much for that. And Mila, could I get you to introduce yourself, who you are, what you do as well?
No, absolutely, pleasure, and it's wonderful to be here and to be hearing about all of this work. So Mila Lukic, I head up Bridges Outcomes Partnerships, and we do a lot of delivery of outcomes contracts with a range of different partners, many of whom are here on the call, and we also pull together the social investment, which is then able to provide some of that upfront funding that we talked about.
Brilliant, thank you so much for that. I'm making sure I'm noting down everyone's questions in the chat so that they don't get missed. So do keep popping them in there. So I think to kick us off, I would love to first of all come to Mila, to come to you to maybe share a little bit about the initial policy context that was happening around the start of social outcomes partnerships, because I know that you were there for that, and maybe especially the UK context for that, just so we get a little bit of an idea of what is the story of where we are beginning in this journey.
No, absolutely, and thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jess, for that. So I suppose just taking a step back, if we reflect on the ecosystem that we are talking about here, some of the ingredients which are particularly, which are needed and particularly effective in creating an ecosystem for more outcomes-based working, as Andrea said at the beginning, at least in the UK, have been the presence of thoughtful co-commissioning funds. And we heard from we heard from James and Neil in terms of the evaluation of particularly the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund, and we'll hear more from James McGowan about the Life Chances Fund, really thoughtful outcomes evaluation. So we obviously heard from government outcomes lab and ECRIS and ATQ, but that's a practice that is important to continue developing. But then there is the delivery perspective, and I suppose from the delivery perspective, that is really where some of that original thinking started back more than 20 years ago now, where the view was basically from the Treasury around how to enable and how to provide more freedom for the VCSE sector to innovate. Because if you think about many of the really brilliant VCSE organizations, let's take some of the domiciliary care provider organizations, they know what is right to do for the individuals that they're trying to support. But sadly, they are prescripted to do a very specific task, let's say 3 times a day, a 15-minute visit for an individual, because that is how they're contracted from the local authority. And the sector was really wanting to do things differently and asking for freedom to innovate. And from the Treasury's perspective, and you can see here a number of the reviews which were done, it was identified that, yes, there is a way of enabling that, but with that flexibility should also come greater accountability for outcomes. So that's kind of the origin of some of the ideas of how to actually enable some of that flexibility and delivery that we're talking about, the social innovation, but aligned with the accountability for actually achieving the outcomes. Now, for that to be possible, and there have been some questions in the chat around it, there needs to be the appropriate financing option for the VCC sector to deliver complex public services. And again, there have been historic reviews 20 years ago outlining from the Home Office and the Bank of England that actually VCC organizations could not access the right sort of capital easily. And that led a number of different initiatives to provide such financing and more patient funding and patient capital. And that's really what led the Cabinet Office to create a 10 million pool of investment back in 2008 to invite organizations to bid to raise at least match funding for that seed pool of funding from the Cabinet Office, and then to use that to really stimulate some of the innovation in delivery. The reason why the government wanted to be an investor was basically to set the terms of risk and reward, to ensure that that financing gap is addressed effectively, to really create an environment where the government can get all of the data, in the most granular detail in terms of the full transparency of all of the outcomes being achieved, and then subsequently to also share equally in the upside should the outcomes be achieved. So to Neil's point around the repayment actually being achieved ultimately from these types of or from this type of delivery. So that is really powerful, and from our perspective, we bid back in 2008 to be a non-for-profit manager, pooling that funding from the Cabinet Office and other organizations, mostly foundations. And we can see, what has happened now over 15 plus years in terms of the innovation that work has catalyzed. And I suppose I would just add for our non-UK colleagues, we are seeing a very similar pattern outside of the UK as well, where it is the development finance institutions which are the anchor organizations. So again, government organizations providing that seed funding for those pooled financing funds to enable that effective partnership between different government institutions on different sides. So at least from our perspective, that has been really powerful in creating the innovation and delivery and creating these thoughtful partnerships.
Thank you so much for that. That was really, really helpful, Mila. James McGowan, I was wondering if we could briefly come to you next. Your team has been the lead for UK government on social outcomes partnerships. You've been operating deeply within this policy context that Mila sort of set for us. What has been your experience of operating in this context, and especially with the Life Chances Fund? And have you got any key reflections from that experience for us?
Yeah, we'll always stick to what the evidence tells us. We're good civil servants in that way, Jess. And so I won't speculate or throw personal views into the mix, because that's not what I'm here to do. I think, look, we look at the feedback that we're getting from the work that yourselves at the Government Outcomes Lab are doing. We're obviously really keen to listen to what James and Neil are saying about what's been achieved and understood from the work of the Commissioning Better Outcomes programme, which was a sister programme to the Social Outcomes Fund when it was launched. And so that's where my views and what I've got to say will come from. Look, the stuff that's come up that's been talked about through this CBO work is reflective of the types of things that we're hearing from the Life Chances Fund, and those are things that are attractive to government. So there is clearly, from what we're seeing so far, evidence of enhanced market stewardship that you see from these types of programs, where the data flows and the way that the partnership comes together operates in a way that creates that ecosystem in local areas in the Life Chances Fund, that is, and clearly from what's being said about the commissioning better outcomes, that enables the market or the kind of collection of organisations that are partnering together to operate in a way which is all focused on the same thing, and the outcomes framework helps to facilitate that. So you have a set of organisations who are effectively putting their shoulders to the wheel to achieve the same things, because the outcomes framework helps them to identify what those things are and to work towards them. But I mean, interestingly, what we're also seeing through the evaluation isn't just those things that get achieved. There are a suite of other things that get achieved too. The outcomes framework, if you like, sets the tempo and gives us the objectives of the programme, what it's trying to achieve. But of course, there are a range of other things that and benefits that can be derived from these programmes too, in terms of wider outcomes that projects would be better to talk to than I can. And the data is really important to that, right? So the strengthened data-led performance management, if you like, or basically evidence of impact, is really important. Obviously, as guardians of public money, and not just us as officials, but politicians will want to be clear on where, how money is being used, and is it effective. We obviously don't want to spend money twice if we can avoid it. We want to make sure that we're doing things that have an impact on people's lives. Sometimes you have to, but the more that you can make that efficiency work and the effectiveness of programs work is clearly important. So data and the use of data to help understand what's happening in programs is really important. We live in a data age, and so it feels like harnessing data to help improve our understanding of impact is a really, really important thing to do. I do appreciate, however, because I've worked on the side of the provider myself in delivering these types of programs, that data collection it's hard work and it can be onerous. So I guess it is through the sort of subsequent programs, it's important that we try to work out how to make that easier and use digital technology in a way which will enable us to collect information on what's happening in a kind of appropriate way, so that it doesn't become the job itself. It is part of it, and I hope we've achieved that to some extent in the Life Chances Fund. But the other, I touched upon partnership, but that collaboration in local areas and seeing where that has worked well and how it has led to that, or what is it that's led to that, is really important. So what's cultivated that collaboration is massively important. Is it just about people? I mean, I often sort of revert back to talking about people, and this is where my personal views do come in, but I often revert back to talking about people because I do think it comes down to really good individuals who really kind of want to make this stuff work in projects. But and so James's reflection earlier on that it different circumstances isn't just because you do a SOP that everything works well. It's about the people who are involved and the different features that are part of the ingredients that make the program work that are important. But if you can get those right people together, if you can create through the structure of the program an environment which people want to work in, can see that they're getting those tangible results in terms of the impact through the data that's being fed back, and allows them to adjust the program to enhance performance, that's got to be a good thing. And that's where I guess we come on to the final point, which is about, if enhanced performance and the ability to see impact is important, then evidently we want to be in a position where the outcomes framework enables frontline practitioners who are trying to achieve that impact the ability to do what they think needs to be done to make that happen. And I hear lots about people talking about contracts that are very prescriptive and provide perhaps too much steer on what a framework says you should do, that tells you the kind of detail of what delivery should be. Whereas actually the objectives in these projects is what's been important. The outcomes is the framework that people work to, and the delivery on the ground can occur in a way which is suitable for that environment and suitable for the people that are working together in that environment, and therefore can be tailored to the needs of the individuals and the circumstances that people are working to in those projects. So those are kind of the headline reflections. They will be unsurprising to yourselves at Go Labs, because you told us that through the evaluation work that you've been doing. But that is key. I think those are the key things that are coming out for us in terms of how this stuff works. And it is, I think, that all trickles down from the way that the program is set up and the different actors that are involved and the blend of expertise they bring to making those different points come together meaningfully and productively. So those are my headline thoughts. As I said, based in our evidence that's come through from the evaluations that we've published so far. Really interesting to hear about what's coming out of the CBO evaluation. Fascinated to see how we can learn from that. And obviously, naturally sitting here and comparing to what we've learned on the Life Chances Fund so far, which is obviously what you're going to do in these circumstances.
Thank you so much for that, James. I've been really enjoying the questions we've been getting in the chat. We've got a few quite big picture questions, which I think I'll come on to shortly. But the first thing I wanted to do is I had a couple of questions that I felt were quite interrelated. I had one from Catherine, who was asking about overcoming organizational culture, where this is a new thing. Also had a question from Russ about CBO, what due diligence happened to help make sure there was readiness for outcomes contracting. So Neil and James, I wondered if you wanted to pick up this thread of how to set up well or make sure that there's appropriate readiness, and how that went for CBO for shifting within an organization, or for a program to be delivered with this more outcomes focus.
Do you want to go first, James, or you want me to have a go?
Maybe I'll give a little one and then by all means over to you. I mean, it's a very good and interesting question. And Mel, actually, at your outcomes conference early on in the month, sort of alluded to this as well. And I think what became clear to organizations and us actually quite early on, you talked earlier about these were perhaps firstly seen as whizzy financial mechanisms. And then I think people quite quickly realized they sort of are, but they're also change management programs, and they're quite disruptive in terms of you have to think in a very different way. And almost everybody within your organization and every organization and every part of that partnership has to think in a very different way. Your finance team needs to think differently. Your practitioners need to think differently. And that, I think, can take some time. I think the feasibility studies helped with that. I think also what helped was the fact that you had a set of intermediaries and investors that knew that, and often they were doing the due diligence on, is this organization ready to take this on? Actually, I think you should invest in your data management system or something else. So I think don't underestimate actually how different it is to operate in. But Neil, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Well, I agree on the second point. On the first point, I think the cultural change, there was a question in the chat about what the development grants were for. They were for feasibility studies, but a lot of the time, speaking personally as an advisor and the advisors I've spoken to, you spend a lot of time addressing those cultural issues and some of the challenges of understanding these complex mechanisms and pointing people to other sources of information, which GoLab is now undoubtedly the leading source in the UK. So you spend, I arbitrarily and without any real evidence guess that I spend about 30% of my time constantly educating stakeholders about the challenges they face and how they face them, which is then compounded by the fact that just when you've got them educated to a very high level, they move on to a new role and you've got to re-educate somebody differently. But an important part of this is people doing their homework really before they start, I think, is very important. So
thank you so much for that. And Mila, I didn't know if you'd like to come in a little bit from Bridget's perspective or experience of helping as an intermediary bring people into this more outcomes contracting world.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a lot of what's been said very, very much resonates, and I suppose it is for going back to fundamentals and really focusing on which are those critical ingredients that are most enabling in creating this different type of delivery and in creating this innovation in delivery. And some of the points, and I was just responding to Joe, but some of the points from our perspective have been real flexibility in delivery and ability to continue evolving delivery based on the learning, but also to create very personalized approaches for whatever the individual or a family needs, and that has been that's been very key in being able to ultimately create different outcomes and better outcomes for individuals. Thinking about how to create truly collaborative systems. And I mean, the Gold Lab talks about that in some of your research in terms of kind of system orchestration, if you will, in thinking about how to bring together, all of the different parts of the system which are trying to interact with that particular individual and family. And Tom Jefford and Kathy and a lot of the family therapy delivery partners can talk about that in great detail in terms of how, what is the system around the family which should be really thought about and brought together. So that's absolute collaboration in both partnership development, but also in ongoing delivery. And then James talked about it as well in terms, or James McGowan talked about it as well in terms of data and how to think about setting up really thoughtful, insightful, and as real time as possible data flows across various different partners, because that is what can then help collectively us create that insight. And and then there is data in terms of kind of different types of I suppose thinking through data in a very holistic way in terms of the different feedback mechanisms that one wants to collect, the different ways that one wants to capture kind of system indicators across both delivery and local authorities or health service, and thinking about how to continuously create that holistic picture. That's been really important.
I also I see one of the questions that we've had from Amita is about picking up this prevention question that sort of came up a little bit earlier, but I think maybe as a panel you might have more reflections on how social outcomes partnerships as a tool, what sort of contexts are most useful and where we're seeing them operate particularly well. It's got a question about why is it especially hard for prevention. Just before I hand over to the panel, what I would say as a general piece of context, and especially in the UK, but is a global thing, there's clearly, as I think James Ronicle said, a good tool doesn't fix a broken system, basically. So if the wider system is already struggling with prevention, a good tool won't be able to just on its own fix that, like social outcomes partnerships. So for example, in the UK, or for any government, there is always a challenge of, do we deal with the fire on the table or the fire that's maybe to come? And I think that's where the question of prevention often comes up. If things are already under a lot of strain in the immediate system, if there is loads of pressure on the current government to deal with issues that are happening right now, it is quite challenging to then justify and take a step back and think bigger to how do we prevent this happening further downstream or move on that upstream prevention angle. So I think that's a helpful thing just to bear in mind when thinking about prevention generally. I think the second thing that can be challenging around prevention is also how you measure it well, because you're measuring what doesn't happen typically. And so there's that question of attribution. It can be an excellent thing, and you can still then find it hard to be like, oh, let me go to Treasury and show the case of how I have stopped this thing not happening, because you don't know 100% certain that it can happen. And so that doesn't mean it's not important, but that again adds a bit of nuance to like, it can be challenging. And yet we have seen this tool of social outcomes partnerships be used in some cases for more preventative approach that's been really helpful. And then I think one of the other things that people have picked up that's been really helpful has been this live data learning. So it can allow for more flexibility as well in service delivery, so that you can work out what's happening in your local system on the ground to be able to improve, adapt as it's going, because you're getting all of this live data. And then this thing of collaboration, being able to bring people together across different areas. We've had a number of questions around prevention, but we've also had quite a few about what is the panel's views just on socks and how to use them well and when to use them and what direction you think they're going in. So I'm keen to give everyone a moment to maybe share their hot take on what they think around this, as much as they feel comfortable. Because we're going to try and hear from everyone, I would ask that we keep it slightly on the shorter side of answering that, and maybe build on one another's answers as you go, or disagree with one another if you disagree. Who would like to go first?
I don't mind going first.
Great, we'll go James and then we'll go Neil.
Not gonna. I mean, all of the things you just asked, I can't cover all of that and be quick about it at the same time. But I mean, you've already said about prevention. What's tough about it? Yeah, if you're doing something that hasn't happened, how can you measure whether or not the fact that you've prevented it from happening? There are obviously the sort of 3 layers of prevention that people tend to talk about. Primary prevention, which is precisely that, preventing something that hasn't already happened, which of course comes with all of its difficulties of how do you. I mean, we talked about cashable savings. Then James was talking about in relation to CBO, and obviously if you prevent something from happening, you can't see it as you can estimate a prevent cost, but it isn't the same as a cashable saving necessarily. But when you get into secondary prevention, where you're looking at reducing the numbers of in terms of a particular issue, then you can to some extent, I guess, start to see prevention and in that regard, or mitigation, if you like, of an issue, or it getting worse. So there is a measurable there. And then obviously the third type of prevention, well, not obviously, but the third type of prevention generally is looked at in terms of the kind of wider impacts of reducing that particular issue, or helping to deal with that particular issue, and that preventing that in effect. So I think there is you will know from anybody who's looked at the GoLabs website that there are some conditions for using social outcomes partnerships that appear to work well, and baked within that is the ability to then hold it the lens over those 3 types of preventions and make an assessment of where it works well. And those conditions are in a very neat little triangle tool that the GoLab use around making sure you have a very defined cohort, you're very clear on the people you want to work with, make sure you've got the systems and referral mechanisms in place to target those individuals and to support them, so that there is no mission drift in terms of the people coming into the program. Then making sure your metrics and pricing are appropriately worked through, so that you can make sure that you're setting the right sort of outcomes that are important for that particular cohort, that are going to tangibly have an impact. And those are sometimes both soft and hard outcomes, because there's a journey that people have to go on sometimes before achieving the hard outcomes, i.e. the outcomes that kind of impact the system and that government will obviously pick up the cost for, in effect, but also have the biggest impact on those people's lives potentially. But the pricing around that is really tricky, because when you get into that space of prevention, particularly in the cost saving part of it for future spend that hasn't happened, it can be hard, and we do appreciate that is not an easy thing to go through. So we're all learning, and I think the learning and sharing of information, just forums like this, but indeed all the information that Huli has fabulously worked on and tried to get up onto the Government Outcomes Hub website, it's all grist to the mill in this regard. It helps people to understand what previous pricing has been, what previous metrics have been, what the combination of those things could be in future versions of these programs, and to ensure that we are using money in a way that allows us to see where it's going and how it's having an impact on people's lives. And that has got to be, I think, ultimately where you get to in working out, well, is this having the preventative effects that we wanted it to have, when you can start to see that line of sight. Otherwise, you're just talking about prevention, and you're hoping that that prevention is happening, and you're perhaps getting reports back telling you that it's happening, but you don't have the evidence trail to show you that it's genuinely having that impact on people's lives. I'll stop there, but that's as best I can do in the short period of time you've given me.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to say even shorter for everyone else. I think we've got maybe a minute tops each for these reflections. So we're going to go to Neil next, then we'll go to Andrea, then we'll go Mila, then James, then Huli. So Neil, then Andrea.
Okay, I'm going to pick up James's last point. I've had endless debate, not just on the CBO evaluation, on all the work I've done over 12 years on this. Are they worth it? They cost 13.9% more than other projects. So we don't know what the counterfactual would be if another project was done to the same standard, and they're not done to the same standard. For all the challenges of these projects, we know what we get. And I've talked to many, many stakeholders in many sectors who say, at least I know what outcomes I'm going to get. I have some way of measuring the impact. And then there will be objections to that and say, it's not a true counterfactual. You haven't measured it to a high quality, blah, blah. Well, other programs do not measure to the same standard, and I'm told constantly that they do, and I've not seen the evidence that they do. So I think they're worth it, because those who invest in them, those who back them, those who commission them, have some clear understanding of what they get back from the programs.
Thank you. A brilliantly hot take. Andrea.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I want to be really careful because at the Government Outcomes Lab, we really have a super fine line that we're balancing for the past 8 years. We can't make claim statements beyond what the evidence to date and our own research tells us, but we also need to be constructive, and we can't afford to say, well, we'll wait until spring next year to say kind of what our views might be. So I think I will just say where I personally see real promise when it comes to social outcome partnerships, and I think this is supported by some of our interim evaluation findings and from what we're hearing from the community of practice, is that I think there's real value in this enhanced accountability for public spending. I used to work in local government, and I've experienced firsthand some of the issues around funding preventative services, but also some of the issues around government not having a clear idea as to the impact and effectiveness of public services. Whereas what we've seen with some of the social outcome partnerships, and in particular with the Life Chances Fund, where we have really granular performance data publicly available, is this really heightened focus on transparency and accountability. And again, that's not a given. That's been a deliberate policy decision and a deliberate decision by all the stakeholders involved in the Life Chances Fund to share that data. And then the second element where we see real promise, potential, and realized potential in a lot of the projects is using social outcome partnerships for more effective public services through this very flexible approach, adaptation, using live performance data, so very much grounded in the evidence base. But I guess just a final point that I feel quite strongly about, and I do want to leave our participants with, is that my sense is, and I think that came across in James's and Neil's presentation from the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund experience and from the Life Chances Fund evaluation, is there elements linked to social outcome partnership or social outcome contract that are more to do with just good commissioning practice. And I guess what I want to encourage people as they're exploring the potential of using social outcome partnerships is also to try to understand actually, well, how might we use this experience to sort of help strengthen public delivery services more widely. And it's a really interesting relationship. James, I think, Ronical, you said, you can't fix a broken system with a tool. So I think it's really interesting, after like quite a few years of austerity and diminishing of capacity within government at local and central level, are we asking social outcome partnerships to do too much and fix gaps that are too deep in our public services? In many ways, I feel like social outcome partnerships can help address some of those gaps, but equally those gaps are perhaps part of the reason why we haven't seen wider, broader adoption of the social outcome partnerships. And I'll leave it there. Sorry, Jess, I went slightly over my time.
So everyone else, I'm going to have to ask you to try and be even shorter, but thank you for that. James, let's go to you next. James Ronical, that is. Sorry.
Oh, I thought it was James. Of course, sorry, James already spoken. I was stupid. I'll just pick up on a point that Neil made and the question around comparing outcomes contracts to other kind of mechanisms. I would say the difference is impact measurement versus impact management. And I think in many other programs, this is where I don't agree with Neil. In many other programs, I would say the impact measurement is often higher. For every outcomes contract I've done, I can tell you of a similar evaluation of a similar program where the measurement was of a higher rigor. But I would say the difference is that often in traditional programs, the program runs and the evaluation and outcome measurement run parallel and don't always talk to each other, and people don't really know what's happened in the program till the end. Whereas I would say in outcomes contracts, it's more impact management, that impact and data measurement is totally embedded within delivery. Everyone's looking at it, everyone's talking about it, and everyone's reacting and adapting in real time to what the data is telling you. So it might not be as rigorous, but it's more embedded in delivery. And I would say that's a key difference between an outcomes contract and any other program that I've looked at.
Thank you. And we're getting some juicy disagreement as well. Mila, can we go to you?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so So much for I suppose just very briefly, I mean, from our perspective, what we see again and again is that in situations where you do need something that's more flexible and personalized, you need the flexibility of the partnership to achieve that. And actually, many of the, if you have a pay for input contract or grant agreement, it is an actual breach of contract to implement those changes in delivery. So it is an actual breach of contract to do some of that impact management that James says. Now, yes, you can do a contract variation and you can have 100 contract variations, but that, that in itself is a process that's pretty challenging. And so it's a tool, it's a mechanism of facilitating partnerships, which can really enable very personalized delivery. From our perspective, from delivery perspective, we see the life-changing outcomes which are achieved when that is done. And we see, I mean, Faye from Norfolk has just left, but we see across the commissioners that we're at least working with, that there is a strong desire to continue doing this work. And we heard similarly from James and Neil that, that is seen from kind of the champions who have already tried this different way of working. There is more to be done in terms of that being kind of business as usual across the country. But yeah, we see some really incredible innovations in the delivery that has happened, and that's really encouraging.
Thank you. And Juliana.
Great, super quick. I would like to go back to David's question. He was asking if the panel thinks if outcomes contracts are better or just different from other types of contracts. And I think I would like to say that they are different. As Andrea was saying before, we have seen outcomes contracts doing very, very well. We have also seen outcomes contracts not performing as expected. So the fact that you're doing an outcomes contract doesn't necessarily mean that you will do better than a traditional contract. But what makes them different, and I feel like here I'm paraphrasing a bit James' response, is the incentive to learn. Because payment is attached to outcomes, you are really incentivized to collect data, to monitor progress on outcome achievements, and to use that data to implement changes in service delivery. So you're always asking yourself the question, how can I make this service better? And what is the data saying about the service that I was providing yesterday? So this is really an incentive to build a learning system. We can also say, do you really need a social outcomes contract to be the learning system? Well, probably not, but within a social outcomes contract, you are very much incentivized to build one. So I really think that's the difference and the richness. But yeah, we don't have time for more, so that's it.
Thank you so much. And I know that there is so much more detail we could go into. So panelists, if you have time, do respond to questions in the chat, give your thoughts there. I'll leave the Zoom on for a tiny bit longer after the meeting ends, just to allow for that if you have time. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending. John, if I could get you to pop up the slide for me. As I've mentioned, we've got a number of more engaging with evidence sessions. So I know this has been a whistle-stop tour, but if you'd like to continue with some of these discussions, but looking through different angles, we've got one coming up in November, which is looking at a project based in India, particularly at how this skill-focused bond its implications for women in the labour force. And then we've got one that will be on mental health and employment and the key findings from a report coming out in December. So there's lots more, and the whole report that we've been referring to that GoLab has published is available on our website. I think there's something in there for everyone. So the first section is looking at all this data stuff that Juliana was particularly presenting on in a lot more detail, and honestly I think it's some of the most beautiful data visualizations I've seen. So if I'm not being too cheeky by saying that about our own, I think it's really nice, even if you're not a data nerd. And then the second section, there is the perspectives from all different parts of the field. So there will be someone who's probably authored a piece from your angle. So depending on what your background is, there should be a piece that really speaks to that. And then the final section, which I had the pleasure of authoring, is myth busting, so some common misconceptions in the field. If you're wanting to have some language for common misconceptions you're coming up against, or maybe you have some confusion, I'd signpost you to that last bit. We've got a nice snappy addressing some of those common myths. And then finally, to say a massive, massive thank you to our panelists. It has been brilliant to hear your thoughts, and I know there's so much more we could keep talking about. And thank you all for attending. Please do share your feedback. We've popped a link in the chat. It's so helpful to hear what you liked, what you didn't like, what you found useful, what you wish you heard more for. The recordings will be up on the website within the next week. The slides will be all there, and we've actually got some more slides very kindly from Mila about the context, so you can dive into all of those things. Thank you all so much. Goodbye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.